In God we trust, but do you struggle with trusting God? The first reading states, "Blessed is he who trusts in the Lord." It is easy to trust God when things are going great or even just going good. But what about when our lives are upside down and very challenging, especially during family stresses, health stresses, financial stresses, and anxiety? Do you always trust in the Lord when bad things happen too? Do you know that God cares and will be with you through them? We must not only trust his love, but his timing too. The gospel today is called Luke's Sermon on the Plain. While it is similar to Matthew's more often quoted Sermon on the Mount, there are differences. Jesus has gone to a mountain to pray, which Luke tells us he does before important moments in his life. Luke's language is much more blunt and uncompromising. Luke's Jesus is very straightforward and focused upon what is important and what is not. He shows in light of God's coming reign what society values might be worthless. This gospel challenges us to honestly examine what are our priorities. What we treasure says much about who we are. In other words, where do we spend most of our time and efforts? When Jesus prays, he chooses the 12 apostles. Then he comes down from the mountain with those 12 to level ground, where there's a large crowd of his disciples, as well as a large number of people waiting for them. They are all from all Judea and Jerusalem and the coastal waters of Tyre and Sidon. In other words, all of Israel is represented here, waiting for Jesus to teach and heal. Even though he had just chosen his disciples, he is already teaching them what it means to be a disciple and not to be above people, but in their midst. Luke's sermon is much like Matthew's as it begins with Beatitudes, but it is shorter, containing only 4 of them, while Matthew's Beatitude numbers 8. However, Luke adds 4 woes that stand in contrast to his Beatitudes. Woes are warnings of extreme caution to those who are wealthy and favored by society. Luke's version gives less attention to Jewish law and practice and has greater focus on us being merciful like God teaches us. Jesus was initiating and proclaiming a great reversal, something that the prophets had promised God would do when the Messiah came. Jesus comes to begin God's work of this reversal and introduce the kingdom of God to the poor of the world, the hungry, those who weep, the ones insulated or denounced for following Jesus and insulted. They have little, while the rich seem to have everything. Poor is a biblical term similar to the word unfortunate, but among the comfortable, the poor are easily overlooked. Luke is telling those who are poor, hungry, hated, excluded, and insulted that they are blessed. The gospel, and particularly this passage, confronts us with a challenge. How do we view ourselves and others? What is the standard by which we measure what truly counts? What seems practical to us is seen differently when viewed through the eyes of the gospel. Things many consider to be the good life are challenged in a gospel that calls those who are poor, hungry, and weeping blessed. What are we to make of this? God created all the wonderful things of the world. Does God really want us to suffer for enjoying his gifts? That can't be correct either. So what is it all about? This has less to do with material possessions as it has to do with the person who possesses them. We need to be open to God, to let him into our lives. How can we be open to God when we are so busy? So many of us, beginning with me, are glued to our electronic devices. I have no idea how many hours I look at my cell phone or computer on an average day, but I assure you I'd be embarrassed to know it. Those fortunate enough to go on a retreat where you have to turn in your phones feel much closer to God without the electronic distractions because they are making more room for Him in their lives. Perhaps you can also see a bit of this in your life. We need to regulate what is taking up so much of our time in our lives that could be shared with loving God and others. Most of us need to make more time for prayer. If you have to look at a screen, put one of the great prayer apps on it to use. Please don't say that we are too busy. We need to remind ourselves that in many ways, we have allowed things to take over our lives. Talking to God daily will help us fight off the temptation to let our possessions and commitments define who we are. The principle running through all the Beatitudes in Luke today is this: we are blessed if we allow ourselves to make room for God and for others. Blessed are we who trust in the Lord.